Hello everyone. Welcome to the DataFlex 19.0 First Look webinar. We're very excited to show you what we've been up to, bringing the next rev of DataFlex to you and all the changes that are in process right now. Really has been, if you look at where we are currently with 18.2, the product has just come so far in the past few years, and now we're just getting ready to take it to the next step. So, what are we doing in 19.0 and how is it going to change your life? One of the first areas that we're focusing on, and admittedly one of the primary areas for 19.0 itself, has to do with connectivity. Connectivity has come a long way, and we started looking at it, and we've looked at some goals of trying to take it to that final phase of making it as natural to use as the embedded database is probably about the best way I can put it. So we have a lot of goals surrounding connectivity. Those of you that are familiar with connectivity, that are using it already, a lot of these terms that I'm going to be talking about are going to be very familiar to you, and you'll say, oh yeah, I understand that. And if you haven't, I'll try and give you enough background so that you understand what this all means to entering connectivity for the first time in 19.0. We're going to try and accomplish these goals for 19.0. Fully integrate connection IDs into the application framework and the studio, actually all our tools, not just the studio. Improve, take better advantage of the natural capabilities of the SQL databases for indexing. Improve the complete flow of application development when you're using SQL as your backend. Everything that is natural in SQL, primary keys, foreign keys, identities, clustered indexes, everything that is natural there, we want to make it more automatic and natural when you're working in DataFlex as your host environment so that you don't have to stretch to get a concept or go out of your comfort zone to take advantage of a natural capability of SQL. Obviously, and that part of that involves improving the login process, support for encrypted credentials, and of course, we're going to do all of this while maintaining 100% backwards compatibility so that regardless of what your starting point is, you can come into this as gently as you want to. So let's talk about connection IDs and taking them and completely integrating them all the way through the framework, all the way through the studio. A connection basic real quick. A connection is how you access SQL data from your application. The connection, it defines everything about how you're going to talk to that data, what kind of driver you're using, where the server is, what kind of connection you're making to that server, your login credentials or whatever, the database that you're connecting to, the table that you're going to be speaking to, the schema that's involved with that table, everything that the language needs to know to be able to use that table as if it was its own is part of this connection. And the connections currently are located in the INT file for each table. Remember, since it talks about what table is involved, you need to have this specified in the INT file for every single table in your application. There could be a few tables, there could be hundreds of tables. Connections, besides establishing the connection between a particular table and your database, it also are used when you're using the tools themselves, so Studio, Database Builder, etc. They need to connect to that same data so that they can model it for you, so that they can show you what tables and columns and indexes are available to your application as from a programming perspective. And then also, if you're going to use embedded SQL, that's a whole different way of connecting to the server, and it needs to use the connection as well. So you've got all this information trying to be used by all of these aspects of your application, the tools, embedded SQL, and connection IDs are simply a way of referring to those connections, move as much as possible out of the individual INT files so that it's all the same and it's easy to change. Connection IDs aren't new, but how well integrated they are into the framework and the tools is what's really new in 19.0. So how are we doing this? There's a whole new class called CConnection. It will now handle all of the connections for our CLI drivers. CLI drivers are MSSQL, DB2, and ODBC. The rev of the drivers as of 19.0 will be 6.2, and that and higher will support these new connections through the C connection class. So what does that do? It's a single global object that allows you to add, edit, remove those connection IDs that I was mentioning. It uses the connection. Use the connection ID in your INI file. So instead of having all of the detail in your INT file, you've got it in your INI file. Log into database servers via those connection IDs. Make embedded SQL connections via those connection IDs. Basically, have everything from the tools up now use those connection IDs in a natural way, so that it's much easier to do a lot of different things. We refer to this new way of looking at connections as managed connections. They're fully supported and used across all the tools in the framework, and it builds on the existing connection and connection ID concepts that have been around for a few years. Kind of look at it as this is, connection IDs 2.0. So how do these managed connections work? Managed connections give you the complete interface. It allows you to add, remove, edit the connection IDs, log in and out to those connection IDs, handle the credentials, including username and encrypted passwords for those connection IDs, switch them dynamically at runtime. While the application is running, you'll be able to easily take a connection ID, switch it, and it can be on a different database, it can be on a different server, it can be using different credentials, pretty much anything that you would need to do to manage where you're pointing your application. All of this will be handled by a very easy to use high-level interface for what you do most of the time, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. But then there'll also be a very complete lower-level interface so that if you have specific things that you want to do, you can handle them at any level you want to in your application, supply your own code for taking over things, change where you're getting things from, storing things to, pretty much anything you want to do. So having these managed connections at the heart of the connectivity, it's going to make it very easy to change servers and databases while testing. It's going to make it much easier to deploy applications. It's going to make it easier to exchange SQL-based workspaces with other developers, whether that's someone else in your own organization or sending it into us from a sports perspective, or one of your customers, or a developer that you're doing some cooperative work with, whoever. You'll be able to do that a whole lot easier. And I was talking about switching, dynamic switching of the connection strings, that really lays the groundwork for a fundamental aspect of multi-tenant applications, because the ability to support easily and quickly changing servers and databases on the fly is one of the things that is paramount for a multi-tenant application, so that when user A from customer A comes in, they're pointing at one set of data, and user B from customer B is pointing at a different set of data. So managed connections are really at the heart of what is happening. How do you use them? Again, there's different levels of using it, but the most simple way is you're going to have a connection ID in a connections INI file. That connection INI file is going to be located in the data folder of your workspace. That's one of the changes. Is we've taken the whole concept of connection IDs and moved them from a more global aspect down to a well-integrated with each workspace. And also within each application, you could actually have multiple connection INI files in a common data folder, but they point different places for different customers. So instead of having all of that connection information out in the INT files, now you've got a simple connection ID, in this case Chinook, in each of the INT files, and then in your connection INI file, it specifies everything else that it needs to know about using the Chinook connection, which driver, where the server is, what the database is, the type of connection. And again, this is very simple using trusted connections for MS SQL. It can be as simple as or as complex as your environment needs to be. How do you then use managed connection in your application? Well, it's pretty simple. You use the new connection package, you declare a connection object, and of course, the connection object's going to consume all those connection IDs wherever they live, however you decide to do it. You register all your connections and you log in. You send login all so that everything can be available to your application. When you create a new application in 19.0, all this will be there. If you were bringing in an older application, this is kind of the level of stuff that you'd have to add. Manage connections and login credentials. Depending upon the database that you're using, obviously if you're using Microsoft SQL Server, trusted connections is the easiest login method. It requires no special accommodation in the INI file. It just kind of works and there you go. With ODBC and other servers that use data sources, DSNs already set up on your system are the easiest way. Again, nothing special in the INI file. If you are not using trusted connections or data sources, you then can get into the situation where you're specifying the username and password credentials. Those will be stored also. The password credentials will be encrypted. There will be one set of login credentials that your applications will use and another set of login credentials that the tools will use. So it kind of separates those out so you can do whatever you need at the tool level, but then have your application test running the same way you would expect to deploy it. The encryption for login credentials for your application, there's going to be a default way to do that and manage it. It's all just going to work out of the box. However, if your circumstances mean that you would like to take more control of that, use a different encryption method, handle things a different way, you'll be able to customize that to your heart's content. And the encryption that the tools are going to use are going to be secure to us because we manage them and they'll just always work no matter what. The compatibility of all this, all managed connections are supported again with our Microsoft DB2 and ODBC connectivity kits with revision 6.2. All of these changes, everything that's happened from the tools down through the drivers, through the language, are all 100% backwards compatible. So if you have existing SQL-based applications, those will continue to work in 19.0 without change. If you're using our drivers, you'll be able to upgrade them easily to bring in the new managed connections, but if you don't want to, you don't have to change a thing. The embedded database applications, those will still work unchanged, nothing wrong there. Pervasive database applications, they'll still work, nothing to change there. So anything that you're currently doing, and when you bring an application into 19.0, you just keep on doing what you're doing. If you like it, it's good, it meets your needs, everything's fine. If you want to use managed connections, it's pretty easy. You go in and add those few things that I showed you a couple of slides ago and set up your new connection ID in your INI file and you're ready to go. The next area of connectivity that we focused on is improving index support. SQL, if you're not familiar with it, can basically, if you're used to the DataFlex database, you have to have your indexes specified completely to use them. If you need indexes for 4 different things and they're different, you have to have 4 different indexes and they've got to be a complete definition of those indexes. SQL is not like that. SQL can order data with as much or as little information as you give it. It'll be more efficient if you can give it a index that's on the server, and the more complete the index, the more efficient it can be, but it can do it without an index at all. It's one of the ways SQL has always worked. So what we want to do is, within the framework, take better advantage of the SQL backend's ability to deal with whatever's there without necessarily having to change the backend and add more indexes, especially when you are when you have a DBA for your customer or your company. They may or may not give you the ability to make backend changes. So having everything happen within the framework and taking as best advantage of it as it can is important in those areas. So you can have a server index that exists on the server. It's defined in the INT file. So DataFlex and the server are completely connected. That is a complete index. Everything that DataFlex thinks is there on the server. If you change one of those, that's going to require a restructure at the server. Then there's a client-only index. It's only defined in the INT, and it only requires an INT file update. It will not try and change anything on the server at all. And then there's a server-only index, and Serverless indexes are interesting, and when we get to the demo, they're going to make more sense. But basically, there's an index that's on the server, but it's not really defined in the INT file because you're not using it as a DataFlex style index. But it's still probably helping you, and that'll be clear when we do the demo. All this stuff is going to be very easy to manage in the studio, and all of this capability of having these different kind of indexes all work more naturally and is actually provides the basis for a brand new thing. Well, it's not brand new. You could do it before, but it was hard to. But for runtime temporary indexes. And runtime temporary indexes from the DataFlex perspective, you create them through the database API. In the old days, if you defined one, it would require a restructure on the server. But now with client-side indexes, and you can define them for your application, you don't need to change anything. So you do it with the same commands you've always used. Create the index, set the number of segments, set the fields that participate at each segment, set the segment direction. All of that is the same commands that you've done for years. But now if you just do them outside of a structure start, structure end, it'll just be there at runtime and nothing will happen at the server, and it doesn't change your application definition of the file either. So the INT file doesn't change, the server doesn't change, but now you've got this new index that you can use. So how do we do that? Well, you go in and you basically, create something to create the index. In this case, it's a function. We get a handle. We, have an index number. We're using the customer table here. We're going to create the index. We're going to tell it there's 3 segments. We're going to add the 3 segments, and then we're going to return the index, and now it's usable by the rest of your application. And you would do it like that. You would say, get that start city, get that new temporary index to its index number, set the ordering. In this case, this just happens to be a report. Set the ordering to that index number, run the report. If I don't need it anymore at the end, delete the index. So this is going to give you a lot of very granular control over special areas that you want in your application. And again, it doesn't matter whether this is a Windows application, a web application, a mobile application, everything is going to be able to take advantage of these runtime temporary indexes. The next part is how we deal from your workspace into data. You basically have a few different things that you need to do at different times. You need to convert data. Maybe you're coming from the embedded database and you're going to SQL Server. You want to connect to data that's already out on the server. That basically a connection is, think about a table that's not been described to your workspace yet. So it's out there. Your workspace doesn't know anything about it. You need to connect to it for the first time. A reconnect. Reconnects are something that happen because it's been out there on the server. Maybe somebody else put it out there and you've never connected to it before, but you know that it came from the DataFlex, and so maybe you have some partial INT files or INT files that don't necessarily match our format. A reconnect will allow you to marry the information that's out on the server to whatever information you have in the INT file to create a new managed connection that is as complete as it can be. You didn't lose anything from the old connection. You didn't lose anything that's out on the backend server. It just works. And then there's refresh, which is everything's in my workspace. I've been using this, but now for whatever reason there's been a change made out on the server. Maybe there's new columns added. Maybe index changes have happened. Things that were not necessarily instigated by you, and that refresh will just update that and bring all those changes in, again, without losing anything that you've already established in your description between DataFlex and the server. Again, all of these should feel natural and fully integrated in the server. We'll look at all of these things that we've talked about in the demo, but managed connections, full support for SQL data types, full support for indexes, being able to connect, reconnect, refresh, etc., bring everything in regardless of where it's come from so that you can move on and have everything be good. In doing some of these things, you end up oftentimes when you want to accomplish A, you need some other things at kind of a lower level to accomplish A, but then they're useful in and of themselves. For instance, the whole ability to deal with what changes will either perform a back-end restructure or only be in the INT file or not require any change in the INT file or the database back-end. Well, we needed a way to check for that, and so allowed structure changes. So now we know for everything that you could possibly do to a connection, whether it will require a table change, whether it will require an INT change, or whether it will require both. And so you can tell your application, we use this in our own tools, that for this table, you can do anything you want, you can only change the INT file, or you can't do squat. And that'll be very useful for your own applications. The connection redirection, after we talked about the remapping of a connection, a managed connection from one place to another, this, again, happens dynamically at runtime. It's very fast. It does assume so that even without using managed connections completely, you'll be able to take advantage of this ability to redirect a connection at the very low level. It'll be a little more interesting to use, but it's there. But it is very fast. It occurs dynamically. One of the things that both of these last points on this slide, it absolutely assumes that all tables have the identical structures. The thing you don't want to do is get into a situation where you're switching from one database to another, one server to another, and now the table structures are different. It's just not where you want to be. So, of course, there's going to be all kinds of other connectivity things here, bug fixes that have been reported since the last release, other minor improvements, but those are the big connectivity things. The next area that we've focused on is the web framework. So we're bringing in a brand new thing called server properties and added a bunch of really nice new controls. Server properties are interesting because web properties, if you're working with web applications at all, web properties were designed to take everything that needed to go out to the client and transmit that from the server to the client and keep taking it back and forth as the application is being used. It's the way the web framework works. Everything on the client is rendered by the JavaScript engine, so we need to tell the JavaScript engine everything that it needs to know about rendering that user interface. So it is mainly the state of the user interface that was where this whole web property thing was born. Almost all of our framework properties need to be on the client. I say almost all just because if I said all, somebody would say, oh, but what about this? But they need to be on the client because the JavaScript engine needs them. When developers started using web properties, because it can store any kind of data, because it can transmit any kind of data in any kind of structure back and forth, they started using it. And sometimes they're needed at the client for the same reason because the JavaScript engine needs it. But a lot of times they're not. They just didn't have a different way to deal with it. So they would either roll their own method to encrypt that data because maybe it was sensitive, or maybe they didn't encrypt it because it wasn't. Or they kind of made a way to keep it from having to use a web property at all, and they stored it on the server instead and maybe added it to the session table or something like that. But essentially you had to build your own thing. If you were transmitting a lot of data back and forth, it might be unnecessary overhead because they're sent back and forth with every call. Once you've used it once, it starts going back and forth with every call. And depending upon the size of the data that you're sending, it could be, it could be slowing things down unnecessarily. So server properties basically remove the need to send anything that isn't required by the JavaScript engine across at all. How is this implemented? Web properties, in the past, you would just set web property equal true. Now there are basically three types of web properties. There's a client web property. This is basically the same as true has always been. This means that once you set it and start to use it, it goes back and forth with every call, the same thing as it's always done. Server, this does not travel back and forth with each call. It stays on the server, and it is attached to the page scope of the application. Then there's server session, same thing. It never goes back and forth. It stays on the server, but it expires when the session expires. So you've got a little bit of extra control over when it's a server property, whether you want it to have page scope or session scope. Again, it's used with any type of data. It uses JSON as its underlying engine, just like client properties, just like web properties have always done. And of course, since we're keeping it on the server, we need a place to store it. It's going to be stored in special tables that are managed by the system. Those tables can be in the embedded database, but generally they're going to work better if you're in the SQL world, just because the backend database is more capable. It doesn't have the same kind of limitations as the embedded database does. So it'll work with anything, but better if you're on SQL. How do you take advantage of server properties? You basically do the same thing that we had to do. Is we went through and said, okay, now that we have these, is there anything in the framework, is there anything that we're doing that really doesn't need to go to the client? If there is, then you're going to change its style of web property from true to server or server session. And if it's not, and if it is still required to go over, you just leave it alone. You don't have to change web property equal true to web property equal client. They are equal, so you can just leave everything alone. And you just go through and change them one by one. You'll find that, again, there'll be very little, if anything, that we change about the framework. That's all going to remain on the client. You'll probably find that unless it's information that's going to the JavaScript engine for, let's say, one of your custom controls, similar to you've expanded the framework, those you're going to still transfer back and forth. You'll probably find that a lot of stuff, maybe even most of your stuff, doesn't need to go to the client at all, and you're going to use the server or server session web properties. Web framework controls is the next area that we've done as far as web applications go. We've added a really nice set of new controls for mobile applications, mainly for mobile. Some of them can be used for desktop applications as well, but mainly for mobile. And we're just going to run through these real quick. First thing is a color picker. A lot of these are not going to need very much explanation because they're pretty obvious what they do. You got a color picker, you'll be able to use it. You'll have a list menu. The list menu will work with existing menu items and supports multiple levels. You've got a header if you want. You have a back button on sublevels, so you've got a nice set of list menus there. Floating panels are a new container type that basically does what it says. It floats, and it can either float by a control so that it's kind of tags along with it, or it'll squeeze the web app out of the way, or push the web app out of the way, or completely, or even just float in a fixed area. So how does that look? Here's a couple examples. You can see on the left there's a floating panel that is floating by a button, and then on the right there's a floating panel that pushed the web app completely off screen, and then when you do something it'll go away and the web app will come back in. Highlight column is a new thing for lists. Basically what you can do within a list is highlight a certain aspect. In this particular thing, you can see that greatest happens to be bolded in everything in the list. There are different options on how highlighting should be performed, but you'll be able to basically take control of the data that's in your list and do certain things based upon other aspects of your application. Accordion controls you'll see a lot of these out there today. Think of accordion controls as, you've got certain, they're containers again, similar to cards and tabs, but they can all be collapsed and you just see the header for each one. And then as you click on a header, that area opens up and maybe all the others collapse, or maybe that opens up and anything that's already opened up can stay opened up as well. You'll have full control over that. And so each leaf of the accordion can be opened and closed, and you can tell it if this one opens, close all the rest. Collapsible groups are another type of container that is very useful to have. You've got a group, there's a plus, there's a minus, the group expands, the group collapses, complete control over that. Style checkboxes and radios are interesting. Normally, when you use a checkbox or a radio button, it's automatically using the native control on that device. So if you're running on an iPhone, or you're running on an Android phone, or you're running on a Windows tablet, whatever the native control is for a checkbox, whatever the native control is for a radio, you'll see it rendered that way, which is great. It makes your application look like its host environment, but you really can't you have very limited capability to style that native control using CSS. You can do a couple things, but not really. So now what you'll be able to do is there's a special CSS selectors and pseudo elements that basically say, stop using the native control, do it this way, and now you'll be able to be as fancy as you want in your CSS. So it basically opens up all of what you can do with your own styling to even those controls that would normally depend upon the native controls. Swipe buttons and cards, again, you've seen this on all kinds of applications. Within a list, you'll be able to swipe left, swipe right, have buttons that then take you elsewhere, do different things. Card containers, if you're using them, swipe card left, swipe card right, everything's lovely. In the Windows framework, let's talk about the Windows framework for a minute. There's a few areas that we've improved in the Windows framework. One of them has to do with DPI awareness. Another is the flat style icons. An alternative approach to MDI in Windows, and obviously there's going to be, the general improvement and fixes. So let's talk about the improved DPI awareness for a minute. When your display changes, you want your application to continue to look consistent and good and rendered well. On high DPI displays, this has, a couple of years ago was very problematic because of the way everything happened, and it would just kind of, stretch things and everything would get fuzzy. Back in 2017, when we implemented the new font system, almost all of that was taken care of, whether it was our dialogues, our controls, Windows controls that we used, Kojak controls that we used. The main thing that happened is with the new font system, as you changed your DPI setting from 100 to 125 to 150, everything got naturally larger and looked clear and life was good, except for icons and bitmaps. And so part of that was that the Kojak at the time did not fully implement a good way to handle icons at higher DPI settings. The newer version does, and so we said, well, now that we're on the newer version, we can improve that and make sure that the framework is taking advantage of those new capabilities. It will basically, the easiest way to look at it is just like with fonts, it'll automatically select the best size icon for the DPI setting of the display when you have your icons compiled in, and it'll just work. As part of this, if you remember back, or not remember back, if you look back, we currently use a combination of icons and bitmaps, and even where we have icons, they were single-sized icons, 16 by 16. Some of them had multiple sizes in it, but the bulk of them didn't. And so what it would do is if it only had 16 by 16, yeah, it could only select the one size, and then it would still, make it bigger, make it smaller, depending upon what it needed to do. So yeah, the size of the icon might get bigger, but the quality of the icon is going to degrade because it's not picking the right size. So we needed to go through and replace all of our simple single-size icons and bitmaps with icons that contain multiple sizes. The multiple sizes are used depending upon what resolution you have, 16 by 16, 20 by 20, etc. And it was interesting because we have a ton of icons, mostly that are used in the studio and the tools. The set that are used in a standard Windows application was relatively small, but we had a bunch of them in there, and faced with having to go in and upgrade the icons to multiple revs, we kind of said, well, maybe this is time to change to more of a flat style of icons that you're seeing in everybody else's Windows apps anyway. So that's what we did. Instead of redoing our old icons, we created a new set of icons that are more of a flat style, and you'll see them. And you're going to face the same kind of decision. The good news is if all you use are the icons that we give you, you're done. Possible other good news is that if you want to put off making this change, everything will work just the same it always has. You just turn off the new capabilities and use your existing icons and bitmaps, and it'll be just as if it was 18.2 or any prior rev. You don't have to use this stuff. So speaking of flat style icons, all of our menu and toolbar icons use the new style. They have the high DPI format capabilities. Everything that's used in the Windows framework will be updated to that. Because for whatever reason you may not be ready, or hey, you just don't like the new style, we'll continue to supply the old set of bitmaps and icons in a subfolder, and you can simply copy them into your workspace and continue to have life the old way until such time as you're ready to, maybe you need to job out your icons to a designer or something like that. But again, everything about this you have complete control over when you go, how deep you go, and the result you get at the end. Also in the Windows environment, we've got what I refer to as an alternative MDI style. If you've been paying attention, you know that Microsoft has not done, basically they really don't care about MDI dialogues anymore. They haven't for some time. They upgraded them when, with the going from Windows to the, Vista Windows 7 look, but then once they got into especially Windows 10, they don't use that style of interface. They don't care about it, so they just look the same way as they always have. So you've got a container, all your lists and stuff all look great. They have that nice flat look in Windows 10, and then your MDI views come up and they still look the old way. So rather than fighting this, we're now supporting an alternative look, and that's with tabbed workspaces. Tabbed workspaces have been doable using the Kojak framework if you use the full framework for quite some time, but now they'll be supported completely in the DataFlex application framework. And instead of overlapping windows, you have tabs. Those tabs can be split vertically, horizontally. You can have multiple views at a time. You select them by selecting their tabs, and there's some special properties to help you manage how they look and how they react, and it's all automatic. If you've never used a tab workspace, but you've used the Studio at any time in the past 5 years, you know what tabs look like and how they behave, because tabs are how the Studio does its thing. Again, completely optional. People like it though. There are developers out there that have been using a tabbed style in their applications for a long time. You're going to say, oh, that's great. You guys have it now too. Let's talk about WebApp Server. We made some kind of fundamental changes to the way the server works, and the first of those is added 64-bit support for the server itself. So now you'll be able to have a simplified installation and configuration of IIS and the WebApp Server. It allows both 32 and 64-bit on the same server if you need it. The administrator will allow applications to be configured to run on other than the default website. If you wanted to do that in the past, you had to go outside of our tools. You could do it, but you had to go outside of our tools. Now it's just part of how you use WebApp. And there's also a new command line interfaces for managing web apps so that you can use our command line and control how a web app is installed and set up. And again, you can use other than the default website. 64-bit support is for the server itself. Think of it this way. All of your DataFlex processes that your compiled DataFlex applications, those are still 32-bit. Nothing's changed there. But now the server can run completely in 64-bit mode. There are a second set of binaries there in the bin64 folder. The ISAPI handler was registered in such a way so it'll automatically pick which binaries it needs to use. So if you're running in 32-bit mode, it'll just automatically use that. 64-bit mode, automatically use that. You can still have a combination of 32-bit and 64-bit web applications running on the same machine if you need to, but it just works. And the nice thing about it is if you're not doing anything special at the IIS ASP level, you just switch and now you're using 64-bit and you don't have to turn 32-bit on and you don't have to turn IIS 6 metabase on anymore, and life is good. The only time you have to pay attention at all is if you are doing things at the IIS or ASP level and you're using controls outside of DataFlex at those levels, you need to make sure that those controls have 64-bit versions that your application can use rather than 32-bit versions. If they do, you use them. If they don't, now you stay in 32-bit mode. keep going on. The command line interface, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but when you don't want to use the application administrator, there is a command line interface that you can use. It has just been updated so that it manages all of the things that need to happen to have the new 64-bit support. It also allows you to specify the website rather than a default website when you're using it to automatically register and manage your web applications. A funny thing happened on the way to server properties. When we started the project of server properties, we needed some extra capabilities that we didn't have. So we needed the ability to take DataFlex data of any type and any complexity and convert it to JSON. And then we needed to take, conversely, JSON data, again, of any type and complexity, and convert it to DataFlex. So we had to build that for us to be able to do server properties well. Meanwhile, DataFlex developers that also use JSON want a JSON parser. There has been some work out in the world where JSON parsers written at the DataFlex level have been around for a while. Those are wonderful things. They'll obviously still work. But what those developers really needed to do, the reason that they wanted a JSON parser is because they needed to take DataFlex data of any type and complexity and convert it to JSON, and then take JSON data and convert it to DataFlex. So they needed to do the same things that we need to do for server properties. The runtime now has that capability. So within the runtime, there are all the capability, all the things that you need to take that DataFlex data, convert it to JSON, and back. And we could have stopped there, but we decided that why not, since we had the car up on the rack and the engine and transmission dropped, why not take the extra time to implement a full JSON parser? So instead of just being able to serialize and deserialize DataFlex data to and from JSON, now you'll be able to, through a single CJSON object class that will have a complete API for parsing, generating, analyzing, manipulating, doing whatever you want to JSON in however way you want it, and it'll all be built into the runtime. So there you go. You've got a brand new parser sitting there. So that's kind of the high-level look at the major things that are happening in DataFlex 19.0. How is this all going to look? So let's see. Let's start off. We'll kind of go back and go through a demo, similar to the order that we had things in these slides. And the first thing I want to do is I'll just bring up SQL Server Management Studio. So I'm sitting here. This is an SQL Server. It happens to be installed with SQL Express on this machine, but the server could be anywhere. The databases could be anything, but I've got some databases out there that I want to start developing applications for. So how do I do that using the new managed connections and all the other capabilities of 19.0 when it comes to dealing with SQL data? Well, I'll go into my studio and I will say, let's create a new workspace. So I go in, I'm going to name this workspace Chinook, and I'm going to create a managed connection for it to use so that everything else just goes better from here. You could create a new workspace and use old style if you wanted to. Remember, we said everything doesn't have to change. You can do whatever you want, but everything I'm going to do is going to be using all of the new capabilities. So I want to create a connection. I'll call it Chinook as well. The server, for those of you that know that if you install things in their default ways, you can just type that in. I'll use Windows Authentication because it's easy. Test my connection. I can log in. That's good. Remember, the tools need to know how to log in. And now I'm going to go out and connect select the Chinook database and say, okay, so now I've got my connection ID established. It knows what the connection string it's going to use. I continue on, and I now have a new workspace with a connection. And again, I can look at this connection. There's a connections manager. If I wanted to change this, I can bring it up and change it whatever I need to, but I've got the basic connection established. So now that I've got a connection established, what can I do? Well, I could, let's say, create a new table right here. So now when I'm creating my table, it knows about my connection ID, so all I have to do is give it a table name, decide what table number I want it to be, and just go on from there. So everything's good. But again, this is if I want to use a managed connection table. I can also, within this same workspace, create a standard good old embedded table, and I can also create, we haven't quite figured out what to call this yet. It says other right now. We're you know, this is, we don't want to say the old style because it's still a perfectly good method to use. Legacy sounds a little bit too fancy, maybe classic, I don't know, that might work well, but basically connecting to tables the way you've always done up until now prior to managed connections. So you've got complete control over how you want to do things, but of course we want to use the new stuff as much as possible. So I know that I've got tables out there. Let's connect to them and see how this stuff is all going to work. So I'll go into database. I'll say connect to database tables. And I'm using, again, managed connection IDs. Once again, if you want things the traditional way, you just uncheck that and everything's the same way it always was. But we want to use the new managed connections. There's our connections. I can even take a look at what the database looks like out at the server to see the types of things I'm going to connect to. There's all my tables within the Chinook database. I say I want to connect. Remember I talked about in the slides whether I'm connecting for the first time or I'm refreshing something, a connection that's already been there, or I'm doing a custom change, whether I've got some combination of connected data, not connected data, updated at the server, updated at the client. This custom will allow me to marry those together in the best possible way so that I have all the latest server stuff and all my existing client stuff married together in a way that makes the best sense. But in this case, I'm just connecting for the first time. I'll go in, select all the tables in that group. I don't need these system tables here. These options are only really applicable if the data came from probably DataFlex in the first place and you're reconnecting. Data is just not normally stored in OEM format out there, and when it was born outside of DataFlex, they don't use dummy dates. They don't. You don't want to map it to a SQL datetime to DF date. So we'll just keep those unchecked. Goes out, finds 11 tables, says those are going to be connected. Knows that there's information out there. Does it want me to automatically look for primary and foreign keys and make sure that those are all modeled in DataFlex? Absolutely. It does those. Creates all of my data dictionaries, and I'm done. So now you can see I've got all of the tables that were out in my database. All these tables here are now described completely to DataFlex, the environment. So let's see what that looks like. If I look at, let's say, the track, and I can open up, remember we talked about the way that a SQL table is described to DataFlex, the language and the framework, is through this intermediate file, this INT file. What does that look like? Well, this is what it looks like. We've got our driver name. Remember, now we're using this Chinook, so all of the details about how it's going to connect to that data, the server that it's going to use, the database that it's going to use, the login credentials that it's going to use, that's all somewhere else now. So this never needs to change. Everything I do for this application, for this workspace, will just use Chinook, and I can change the underpinnings of Chinook however I want, ahead of time, on the fly, but I write my application as if it's only talking to a single identity, which is this Chinook. The database name, its schema name, and then everything that it needs to know about the different columns and indexes. All of this is essential for DataFlex to view this table as something that the framework and the language can naturally consume. So what does this all look like in the table editor? Well, you can see I've got all of my columns that are defined in that table. I can see which columns are participating in as the primary key. I have full control over that now. I could change the primary key. I can add other columns to the primary key. Everything about that primary key is now controlled through the studio. If it needs to change something on the back end, it will. I've also got the type of all your columns, and all these types are everything that is available in that particular version of SQL Server. So Doesn't matter what type of data it's out there. It'll be able to understand it, talk to it, and then map it to its DataFlex type. So that's, again, this is the connection between how things are out in the SQL world and how DataFlex looks at them from your application perspective. You can see I have the relationships here. It knows that the track relates to albums, it relates to genre, and it relates to media type. And then it also has all the index information. And this is where things kind of get interesting. This, for those of you that have been using SQL, things are looking a little different right now. You've got 4 indexes, but then there's these other 3 that are server only. Well, the first index is the primary key. It's the track ID. You can tell that it's the primary key because track ID is up here. Also, SQL likes to name its indexes by what they do. So you've got this PK track that kind of tells people what's going on. It's a server index. Think of server indexes as being fully described. It's at the server and it's in my INT file. So there's a complete one-to-one connection between what's at the server, what I think it looks like from a DataFlex perspective. If I change something at either place, I need to update that connection and make sure that the description is accurate. If I change it from here, it's going to do a restructure. Now I've got indexes 2, 3, and 4, and you can see that these say client only. And it's album ID and track ID. If I look at this server only index, this is album ID. Remember, we talked about SQL Server can kind of index anything. Well, in the case of related information, in the related from field, DataFlex wants things to be unique. If you have a lot of different tracks that are for the same album, I want to be able to see them in a particular order, so I want them by album ID and then within album by track ID. Well, people don't do that naturally in the SQL world, so you end up with an index that's just album ID. Where's track ID? It's not there. So if you wanted to use this index, you really needed to add something to it for DataFlex to be able to do all the things that it needs to do. So instead of modifying this server index to fit our needs, it said, wait a minute, I know what I can do there. I'll create this index that is album ID, I'll put track ID, and I'll make it client only. And again, you can see that back in the INT file where here's my index 2, and it says it's IFK is basically when you're looking at an index it's a foreign key, which is usually the basis of relationships. It's segments 2, and I added that. It was field 3, but then I added that second segment to make it unique so that DataFlex can understand it. So everything just works right there. I've got all of these indexes described. These are the ones that are naturally used in my program. Remember, when you use numbered indexes, these are the indexes that you can use DataFlex commands on. If you have DEOs and those DEOs have their main index number set to one of these numbers, it'll automatically do the finding there. If you say find by index 3, it'll automatically do the finding. If you say find by the index name, it'll automatically do the finding. So any time you see an index that's numbered here, it is completely usable in DataFlex and works the way it always has. If you see the server-only indexes, they're useful because they are the underpinnings of the numbered indexes, but I didn't have to change them to use them. So this is where we marry being able to seamlessly provide whatever you need in DataFlex without having to go out and change the server. And as an interesting point here, like for instance, I can go to one of these client-only indexes, and I can say here, let's add another segment here just for the sake of argument. I'll do composer, and now obviously I need to update this. In the past, I would have needed to update the server and change and do a restructure at the server. But now, when I have that saved, I just go in and look at the this is index 2. And look at the here, and now in index 2, you can see I've added that extra field segment. Index 2 will act as if that really exists at the server, but I didn't have to go and talk to the DBA or make any changes to the backend database. It just works. Again, seamlessly. And if you wanted to make it a backend change, you have full control over that, but you don't have to, and everything just goes the way you want it to go. Other things to look at while we're here, remember we talked about making the studio uh, act more natural and have it easy to use. If you look at, let's say, field information, one of the things that happened is the various database attributes are now much more simplified. So you're seeing, more human readable versions of them there instead of, df underscore field underscore name. It kind of strips all the general things off and also reorganizes them so that it makes it easier to understand what is applicable to the thing that you're trying to deal with. So all of the column properties, all of the index properties, all of the relationship properties, everything is redone and you can find out more about it. It tells you where it is, and it's just, again, much more understandable and more like you've always done with DataFlex. Again, we always go back to making it feel like you're not doing anything different. You're just now using SQL and getting all the advantages and power of SQL. And all of this happens when you convert as well. You take an existing DataFlex embedded database app, convert it over, use managed connections, and boom, all of this stuff opens up. Super simple. Property panel. And like I said, if I had changed something that was, let's say, a primary key or a server-only index, obviously that would have still done the full restructure at the server. We talked about being able to change, control and change these connections on the fly. Well, let's see what that looks like. So if I go in and look at album and go in and use the table viewer, and you can see that I've got some data here, and this is data that's coming out from that particular database and that particular table. But now I can go in and let's go to our database connections and let's edit this connection, and instead of using Chinook, let's use Chinook 2. So it just so happens that I have remember the rule has to be exact. I have Chinook 2 out there. I'll do that instead. So now I've got Chinook 2, and I say save, and you'll notice that it closed the views that were talking to any of those tables. Well, that's probably going to change before release, but essentially we now are pointing to a completely different set of data. So anything that was opened for the old set had to be closed. It'll probably reopen the same views with the new. This happens to be a database on the same server. I could have easily connected to a completely different server and it would have done the same thing. So now if I go out and view that data, what I did was I slightly modified the data so that you could tell it was a different database. So now that album number 1 has Chinook 2 in it. And again, this can happen. Obviously, it's completely integrated with the tools so that as a developer, you're going to be able to say, oh, let me connect to this set of data and see how it's working, or this set of data, or whatever. As an application user, they'll be able to select whatever you give them the ability to, and even at web applications, you would be able to have different calls going to different databases depending upon which customer that was in a multi-tenant type environment. So it just works. But everything's there, and it all looks the same. So that's how we deal with connection IDs. That's how it works. That's how the studio works. I don't have time to create an application here, but you can see just by using the tools that it's all just so well integrated now. It's just smooth. And you say, okay, well that's great, but I've got all these existing applications that don't use connection IDs. What am I going to have to go through? Well, I kind of promised you in the slides that it was going to be fall off a log simple. Well, let's see. Let's go, and it just so happens that I happen to have an 18.2 version of Chinook. So I'm going to go open that workspace, and here it is right here. And of course, it's an older workspace, so it wants to migrate it. I'll just say do this and call it Chinook migrated. Oops, would help if I didn't have my caps lock on. It's going to do it there. Super simple. So now I've got my Chinook application here. You can see that I've got the same tables here, but if I go and look at the INT files, Well, guess what? They're using the old style of, having it completely in there. They might have even used connection ID, but it wouldn't have been understood by the studio and everything else as a managed connection. So how do I bring these tables into the real world? Well, I'll establish a connection and say this as, I'm using a different name just so that you know I'm not cheating and using something else that was there. I will go SQL Express, use Windows Authentication, select my database name. Oops, yeah, I just didn't connect. Just so that you can tell that it's nothing special with Chinook. I actually have a copy of Chinook out there that is basically by any other name. So I'll pick that, say OK, test the connection, make sure I can log in, save it. And now when I go look at the INT file for, it's still the same way. Wait a minute, I've established my database connection. Why isn't it using it? Well, remember we talked about refreshing? Let's go in and do our connection. Say that we want to use the managed connection. Say that we want to refresh. Pick the tables that we want to refresh. And voila. We are now using managed connection in an application that I just brought in. Of course, if I had my actual programs here, I would go in to the source code. Remember, I would use that package, add that C connection class, and send those two messages to register all the connections and log them all in, and then I'd be off and running. So that's how easy it is to take existing applications and bring them into the managed connection fold. Let's see, what else do we need to play with? Oh, WebApp Server. Let's get these out of the way and look at, I'm going to go to IIS first. Here's IIS Manager, and one of the things that I want you to notice here is, I've got my default website. I should have had another website set up so I could have demoed that, but you got to take my word for it sometimes that things just work. But if I look at the application pool and look at its settings, one of the things that that you have to have set up prior to this is you have to have 32-bit applications enabled, and you also have to have IIS-6 Metabase. Well, I don't. I have those turned off here. So, of course, if I want to go and look at the order entry, the web order mobile 18.2 application, and I run that, well, guess what? It can't run because there's no 64-bit server there. But if I go in and say, let's change that to 19, there you go. I have a running application. So no IIS-6 Metabase, no 32-bit application pool, but everything just runs. Let's see. Next up, DPI awareness. This is kind of a fun one. And DPI awareness, what I've done here is it's kind of a pain to change resolution levels. If you, on the same machine, you have to log out and log back in. So enter virtual machines. So I've got some virtual machines set up here. I've got one running at 100%, and you can see what the desktop looks like. 100%, 125%, 150%. So let's go back and look at what 18.2 did as the resolution changed. Now, remember that things are going to get bigger and bigger here, but don't look at it solely as they're getting bigger. Remember, the main reason that you want higher DPI settings, 125, 150, is because you've got a much higher resolution screen, but it got smaller. Think of how this would look on a Surface Pro or a 12-inch laptop or anything under a large screen. So let's look at what 18.2 looks like at 100%. Well, it looks normal. Everything's fine. We've got our other standard icons. The menus and toolbars are fine. Everything's good. We go to 125%, and now, Remember we said that the font changes that we made handled everything else, and everything else got bigger as it should, and everything looks crisp and clear as it should, but you'll notice that the icons didn't get any larger. So now all of a sudden there's this growing disparity between the icons that are in the toolbars and the menus and what the rest of the application starts to look like. It's not terrible at 125, but when you get it to 150, now all of a sudden things are looking really out of whack. You've got this little tiny toolbar here, these little tiny icons. Now the menus got bigger because remember they contain text, but the icons themselves didn't get any bigger. And especially in the studio, this can get really nasty. So that's the way it did in the old days. So now let's see what happens with the new stuff in 19. I'm going to use 19 using the old style bitmaps first. So now I've got my application, and you can see it looks just the same as it did in 18.2. You'll see this little thing right here. That tells me that it automatically selected and used. This is just a little thing we put in for the demo. It's selecting and using the 16 by 16 version of the bitmaps. So now I go to 125% and I use 19 with old style bitmaps. And you can see that the bitmaps got bigger because it needs 24 size, not 16 size. But look at how they've started to degrade, because even though it's doing the scaling, there's no secondary icons in there for it to pick a better size. So now it's getting a little bit hairy there, and when you go to 150%, it looks even worse. So now you've got the scaling happening, but you're starting to degrade. So if you were using your existing stuff on 19 and you turned on the new stuff, this is the type of thing you would have to deal with. And it really depends upon your icons, whether they're going to look okay or middling or really bad. So you're just going to have to play with it and see what you think. If we go back to here and now say, let's look at the new stuff. So now I've got the nice, beautiful flat icons. I go to 125%. I've got them there. You can see how they not only got larger, as they should, but they are now remaining crisp and clear. And especially when I go to 150%, again, they've gotten quite large, but they're still super clear. So that's how everything works from a high DPI perspective. Everything just works. Oh, and by the way, the way that I did this 19.0 old style is that was just using the old style bitmaps. I copied them in to my bitmaps folder, and it just worked the same old way that it always did. So that's how everything works there. While we're here, it's kind of interesting to look at the other thing we were talking about is the alternative style of MDI applications. You'll notice that this is Windows 10. It doesn't really matter that I'm at a high DPI, but you'll see that you've got this nice, crisp, clear, flat application. You've got nice, crisp, clear, flat modal dialogues, but look at what we have for the MDI view. Now, what some people do is they just say, okay, I'm not going to use MDI, I'll use SDI, where the view takes up the whole area. And again, you can do that, and some people even like an SDI application, but how can we deal with an application where I don't want to use SDI, I still want to have multiple views be able to be up at the same time, I want that interaction between views, but I don't want it to have this old style look. So enter the tabbed workspace. So you can look at this now and see that now, instead of an MDI view, I've got this tabbed workspace. It's, like I said, you'll recognize this from other applications and the studio. There's a tab. It's got a view on it. I can open up multiple views. I get different tabs. I select the view by selecting the tab, and I've got this nice tabbed interface. We've added some other aspects to this. This extra toolbar right here is just something that we have in for testing. But for instance, I want to, instead of having the views kind of stay upper left, I want to center them more. So now when I have center views on, they'll center better. Turn that back on and turn this off. All right, so I've got a nice centered view there. The other thing that I can do is I can also grab a tab and bring it down and say, I want these two to be simultaneous. So now I've got two sets of tab views. I can open up as many views as I want. So now I've got multiple views in this side, multiple tabs in this side. I can close these up, and instead of having them horizontally split, I'll vertically split them. So again, I can open up as many views as I want. I can have the tabs. I can drag them around. It's a nice, clean interface that kind of completely gets rid of that old style kind of antiquated look of the MDI client. And again, fully selectable by you. You can do it. You can not do it. It's completely up to you. And I think that that concludes our demonstration portion. So we've showed things about connectivity. We've showed things about the WebApp Server. We've talked about DPI awareness. We've talked about the new flat icons. Actually, before I do this, I do want to show you one more thing really quick in here is, again, when you go back to the studio, because the studio uses icons a whole lot more. So again, the studio, when it's running at 100%, actually I wanted to bring the old one up. When that's running at 100%, even the old studio looks good. But when you're starting to be out at 150%, it becomes a whole lot more important. Because now everything's really large except all these very important buttons and then the icons that are on the menu. So, and again, don't think about this now on this big screen. Think about if we were trying to use these buttons when you're on a 12-inch laptop or even a 14-inch laptop. It becomes very, very important. And of course, then you've got the way that the new icons look. So not only did they get bigger, they look a whole lot nicer, and you've got that nice, clean, flat style to your toolbar in the studio. And that concludes our demo. Timeline. Where are we? Where are we going next? Obviously, we're in mid-September now. We've given a first look. We actually are doing this a little earlier in the process because some of these changes, especially connectivity things, we want to be able to openly discuss with developers that are using other techniques now. So we wanted to not have to do anything more without having the story out there in front of the entire developer community worldwide. So that's why we did the first look now. In about a month from now, or almost exactly a month from now, there's a wonderful little get-together in Brisbane, Australia going on called DAPCon. So, and one of the things that's going to allow us to do, since it's a multi-day developer conference, is we can, instead of trying to jam everything into an hour, we can spend a lot more time looking at various aspects of this and demo it to a deeper level. So there will be a number of 19.0 oriented presentations at DAPCon, a more in-depth overview, dealing with Windows applications, really getting in-depth on connectivity, deploying web applications. I will be there. John Van Houten will be there. I believe Chuck Atkinson will be there from Data Access. So we look forward to being there with you. If you're anywhere in Australia, New Zealand, or the Asia Pacific area, please register to DAPCon, come by and see us, and it'll be a good time, and we'll be able to take a lot closer look at what's going on. Alpha is going to be in the November-December timeframe. Obviously, we're trying to get it as fast as we can, but it needs to be stable as well. And at that point, we'll also open up a new testing forum for DataFlex 2017, just like we always do. And that's pretty much it. So thank you for your attention. And I know we're about an hour and 5 minutes into the actual presentation, an hour 10 since we started, but I think if you want to stick around and have some question and answers, John and I will be here. And if you can't, thank you for coming by. We really appreciate you giving 19.0 this look with us, and we can't wait to put it in your hands. Take care now.
Thanks, Steve. What I've done is a couple people have asked some questions, and so not a whole lot, but it's probably worth running through these. Some of these, Steve, I might throw at you. Some of these I just might go ahead and answer. And the first couple ones fall into the ones I'll just answer. It was asked, was the limit removed on indexes so you can, above 15, so you can have more client-only indexes? And the answer to that is actually that limit has been removed for a long time. You can actually have more than 15 indexes. It's just instead of referring to them as index.1 and index.15, you just refer to them by their number. And what that also, what about with temporary indexes? What about the numbering for that? Well, when you create a temporary index, it just gives you a number. It's a temporary number. Think of it more like a handle. And how many of those can you have? You can have as many as you want. But please be reasonable. And then there was another question, though. So, well, what happens with the temporary index if your program crashes before deleting the temporary index? And here's the good news: is that this is where we're taking advantage of SQL. The indexes are not created on the server at all. There is no temporary index created. All you're doing is you're creating an index definition. So when you create a when you create a temporary index, all you're doing is you're saying, SQL, when I ask for this data, I'm going to tell you the ordering. You go ahead and give it to me in that order using the best strategy you can. And so this is one of the powers of the temporary runtime indexes, is they're not really indexes at all. You're just telling the server, give it to me in this order, and telling the server to do that. And then the other question, Steve, and I'll let you handle these, is so will these indexing features and actually the connectivity changes we've discussed in general, is this just limited to MS SQL?
No, it'll work for all of our drivers. It'll work for the MS SQL driver. It'll work for the DB2 driver. It'll work for any backend that you're talking to via ODBC.
But not the pervasive drivers, right?
Correct. Pervasive, well, yeah. That's not 100% true, because there are two ways to talk to pervasive. You can talk to pervasive via a transactional interface, which is basically almost exactly like the embedded database works. That doesn't change. You can also talk to pervasive tables through an SQL interface, a relational interface, and that would work because you're really using the ODBC driver talking to the pervasive backend using a pervasive ODBC driver. So you can use some of this with, it just so happens that the reason most people use pervasive is because they want it to be like the embedded database, that transactional interface. So most people that use pervasive probably still use the transactional interface completely. That wouldn't change.
Okay. I think that answers it. Mike Mullen had an interesting question, which was, will data access provide a reasonable, or in this case the data accessor, provide a reasonably priced service to upgrade match my existing icons to match the style of the new flat icons?
That is an interesting question. It's actually something that we've talked about. I don't know the exact status of that, but you know, people are going to need to do this, and as a company, we will do our best to point developers in the best direction possible. That may be through data access, it may be through something viewed domestically. It may be through resources that we know of that we know can do a good job. But we'll do our best to point you in the right direction, and hopefully that'll be to another extension on our line, and we'll take care of you.
Okay, and just some feedback, which means that the message got through, is Samuel Pizarro was very, very excited about the changes in the client-side indexes, and saying this is going to be a big help for him because he is occasionally hooking into databases where he can't control the index, and if it's a partial index, he hadn't been able to use it, and this is going to solve that problem. I think this is going to be a very useful feature for a lot of people. There's a couple questions that I had that
do we allow you to ask questions?
well, only if I answer them myself. Which I mean, the one thing I thought was, okay, so you said you've introduced these tabbed workspaces. Hasn't that been available in hasn't that been available in the code shop controls for quite a long time? And the answer is yes. They have been available for quite a while, but if you try to use those with the MDI system with views, you probably found that it's not very satisfactory. That the views either get like way too wide with the anchoring, and it's very that then when they don't fit, but they don't scroll. What we showed you actually is much more than just saying let's use tab workspaces. It's like, yeah, let's use tab workspaces, but let's change the entire anchoring system so that it fits in a tab workspace thing, and let's add scrolling windows so it fits within the limited sizes that you might create when you start splitting windows. And so the way to think of the new tab workspace is it's almost like it's a combination between the way the studio behaves and its central tabbed workspace and the way desktop web applications look right now, which is each view has its own page. The other question I had, which I'd like to answer, is what's this refresh thing, and how is it different? How is it different than the previous reconnect from different versions? And any of you who have worked very much with the drivers know that you can use the reconnect to reconnect to a table that you've already that either hasn't been connected or you can then say connect again and it will connect to it. But what happens is when you do that, you lose the information that was customized in your int file. So when you do the connect, the indexes may not be in the same order. If you had set custom lengths, custom sizes, various things, those got lost, and then you had to put them back in. And then the other option we had in the studio was this thing called refresh that really didn't do very much. It just basically cleared the cache and just put things up to date. But where there was always problems is someone made a change in the back end, and then you needed to refresh the definition in DataFlex, but not just refresh not just say start over and bring the whole thing in, but you want to say there's a couple changes, but I want to merge it into my existing definition. And that's what the refresh option in the Connect wizard, and that's what the refresh is going to do in the studio, which basically what it means is anytime you think a table may be changed, you can do a refresh. All of your existing int file customizations will be maintained, but it will also bring in the changes from the back end. And so it will now be a merging behavior instead of a replacement behavior. And what this should do is make the whole conversion from embedded, then making minor changes, making changes in the back end, making changes in your tools. It should just make all that stuff work much, much more smoothly. And let me see if we've got looks like there was a couple other questions here. Emil says he did not want to distribute his dfcon I file. Is it possible to bypass it? And yes, it is. There's a whole using the connection INI file is just one way to do managed connections. It's probably the easiest way to do managed connections, and but you can there's numerous other ways to do it. However, Emil, I suspect you will want to use those files. And there was can 19.0 open and let me modify my program made by an older version of DataFlex? Steve, you want to answer that?
Well, yeah, that's basically you migrate that workspace from the older version into 19.0, and then you start using it 19.0. Now, because of the way it's worded, I want to make sure that once you bring it into 19.0, it lives in 19.0. You can't then go back and once you start using all these new capabilities, you can't go. It's going to change code and do things that you don't exist in prior revs. So you're migrating to 19.0. You're not using 19.0 to make changes to a application that you expect to still live, quote unquote, in a prior rev. But you migrate it, and then you're off and running.
Okay, and there's other questions, but we're really running out of time, and I think maybe I'll save the last one. This is actually another internal question. This came from Dennis, where he says, any idea about performance issues of client-side versus server-side indexes? And what he says is, I assume you're just using SQL to perform the ordering, but how fast will it be if no server-side index is available? Shall I take that, Steve, or do you want to take that?
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, and it means if you appreciate the question, it means you understand the advantages and disadvantages of client-side indexes, which is, yes, when you create a temporary index, if there's no underlying index available, SQL is going to come up with its own strategy to find the records, sort the records, and then give you the records. And so if you're like running a report and you're just like running right through it, it'll do that one time, and it will use whatever strategies and capabilities SQL has. Will that be fast enough? Maybe, maybe not. Never underestimate how fast SQL is. If it's not fast enough, what would you do? Well, you could actually then you could then go to your DB and say, can you give me an index, or let's say you create an index, but you may not even create a complete index, you would create a partial index. And what that would do is it would reduce, it would make the access faster, but still not as fast as having a completed index. And if you say that's not fast enough, then what you would need to do is provide a full index. The advantage of both client-side indexes and also the advantage of temporary runtime indexes is that SQL is really, really fast, and unless you've got a huge amount of data, you're probably going to get the performance you need. And if you don't, then you do what everyone else in the SQL world does, which is you figure out how to optimize it, usually by providing indexes.
I knew that.
And
I'm just tired of talking.
yeah. And we've got other questions, but we're sort of we're into this an hour and a half, so it's probably best to let it go. I'd like to personally thank Stephen for doing this presentation. There's a lot of good stuff coming in DataFlex 2017, and I think you did a great job of showing that. And so I will thank you I will speak as just one of the people listening to the presentations. Thanks, Stephen, and good job.
Thanks. And thanks to everybody out there from all of Data Access and especially the development team. And now we get to get back to work and try and get this stuff finished enough to put in your hands, and then the real excitement starts. Take care, everyone.